Yesterday was really the 50th anniversary of your paddling the Gauley River, and I was honored to be with you yesterday. We paddled the lower.
Oh, it's fun. The thing that keeps me going is you're not only in beautiful places, but you have great people.
Charlie Walbridge, it is so great to be with you here on the banks of the Gauley River this Sunday in mid-September 2021. Thank you for your willingness to be interviewed. This interview is on behalf of Southern Appalachian Paddlesports Museum. You've had a profound effect on this sport, not just in the Southern Appalachians, but really worldwide, and particularly in the area of safety. Whitewater safety would not be what it is today without the efforts you've made and the leadership you've provided, and you've been active on other fronts in the sport. So we're going to get into all that, all the chapters of your involvement, but we need to celebrate. For starters, yesterday was essentially the 50th anniversary of your getting on and paddling the Gauley River, and I was honored to be with you yesterday. We paddled the lower, and talk for a minute about the specialness to you of doing the Gauley for 50 years and what it's like for you now compared to back in the beginning.
Well, I think during your paddling career it keeps changing. For at first you're trying to learn things. You're seeing new rivers. And then as your skills get together, you're starting to push yourself to see how far you could go. And I can remember there would be times when I would go down the Yacht and I would be shadowing somebody trying to do the moves that they did. And then I got into racing, and I had dreams that maybe someday I was going to make the U.S. Whitewater team.
Slalom racing. And maybe a little wild water.
Oh, I did wild water.
Right.
My big push for the team was in wild water.
Okay.
But didn't quite make it. Was never one of the top four. And then just spent a lot of time running rivers, and that was when I did a lot of guiding mostly on the Cheat River, and also started to bring new people into the sport. You're less out there looking to push the limits and more out enjoying yourself, bringing new people in, and it happens gradually. I went to California when I was in my mid-30s, and I'd heard so much about the California rivers, I was just excited to go there. And after 2 weeks of running things like the Middle Fork of the Feather, which were hard, but they weren't the really hard things, I said, these rivers are the most beautiful things in the world, but most of them are way too hard for me. And, you get older, you're not able to do some of the things that you did, but what really doesn't change is the joy of getting onto a beautiful river like this with your friends. Nothing better.
Well, it was sure great yesterday, and some of your friends up in this part of the country. You live in Maryland.
No, actually West Virginia.
West Virginia, I'm sorry.
Near Morgantown.
Near Morgantown, and I live down in Asheville, so it was fun to connect with the friends that were along, and clearly everybody loves being together on the river. Well, let's dial back in time a little bit. And I've read some of your biographical information that's out there online and elsewhere, and I've heard you interviewed before. Of course, you and I have known each other a few years as well. But I found it interesting to understand that you grew up in New York City, a complete urban product as in childhood, and you found your way to Camp Maugley. And tell me about Camp Maugley, where it is, how it got its name, and the effect it had on your life.
Well, Mowgli is an old traditional 8-week sleepaway camp, and it's only 7 weeks now because schools start earlier, but it's been going since 1903. The lady who started it, Elizabeth Ford Holt, was a friend of Rudyard Kipling's, and she got permission to use the name Mowgli. And it's an outdoor experience. You're in a building, a dorm with like 15 kids your own age and 4 staff who try to keep some kind of control over the thing. And there are a lot of different activities. And the first couple of years, I played a lot of croquet with my buddies, and really didn't do very much. But as I got older and got a little bit more proficient physically, I was able to, go on backpacking trips and earn a few awards, and really get comfortable in the outdoors. And to me, that was the biggest gift. And then I became a counselor, and I'm like 16 years old, and I'm running activities. I'm leading kids. Now, of course, not every 16-year-old would necessarily get to do that, but if you have the ability and the motivation, you get a lot of responsibility at these camps. And I learned a lot, grew up a lot, and
you became adventurous.
Oh yeah, definitely adventurous. Although I really liked hiking. And I didn't get into paddling really until I got to college, because I really wanted to climb mountains. But I was in college in central Pennsylvania, and the mountains are, well, they're kind of boring. They're long, flat ridges. And
whereas the Whitewater rivers are plentiful, or not. There are more of those than there are challenging mountains. At least.
There are a lot of them, and fortunately, most of them aren't too difficult, because we were just stupid enough that we might have gotten ourselves in over our heads. But there was no outing club at Bucknell, but me and my roommate, who was also a camp counselor, we started the outing club, and we did hikes, and there were people who did caves. I never liked caves very much, and my buddy really liked to canoe, and so I was doing football, and so after spring football was over, we went canoeing, and I said, wow, this is gorgeous. This is a beautiful river going down this valley, and you could just sit there, and you didn't have to carry a pack. You could just watch it happen and make your way around the rocks. Of course, I got a little scared a few times on Class 1 to 2 Penns Creek, but that's part of the business of getting started.
Well, and Bucknell University is about an hour from Penn State University, and at some point you stumbled on the fact that Penn State had some athletic paddlers that were pursuing slalom racing as well as river running, and you started heading over there to visit and learn and make paddling friends of that group.
Well, my junior year, a couple of us got kayaks. I bought a Klepper kayak.
And your junior year would be roughly which calendar year?
The junior year, probably 1969, 1970. I'd really have to think about it. But I got a kayak. A friend of mine got a kayak, and we wanted to learn more. And somebody told us that Penn State had this great outing club. So I wrote Penn State saying that we had kayaks and we wanted to learn more, especially get into racing, because what had inspired us all with kayaks, I wasn't there, I was still practicing football, but some of our guys went up to the Loyalsock when there was a race going on, and they came back and said, wow, there are all these guys with kayaks and they're going through these gates, and it's just really amazing, we got to get kayaks. And so we eventually got kayaks, and we were trying to teach ourselves, and we had to negotiate to get into the college pool. And that was an interesting story because Coach Reynolds was not enthusiastic of letting those boats in my pool. So we talked to our faculty advisor, and he said, let me talk to him. And he was apparently the chair of a committee called the Place of Sport and University Life. And he said, well, if you can't see your way to doing something, we'll just have to bring you out and discuss this in front of the committee. And needless to say, he found time for us, 8 to 12 on Sunday mornings. He didn't think we'd do it, but of course he underestimated us.
Hey, that's prom paddling time every week for all of us.
But so I wrote a letter to Penn State, and it was eventually answered by John Sweet, who invited us to their pool sessions. And I get to the pool sessions, and of course, you know, we were halfway, you know, sort of learning beginners, and all of a sudden you see guys like Sweet and Norm Holcomb and Tom Irwin and Draper and Schultz and, you know, just these nationals class paddlers going through their routine, and it was like, wow, this is just incredible. And I got out of the pool, and Norman Holcomb walks up to me and he says, Charlie, you are really too big for a kayak. And kayaks are really for women and small, wimpy men. You need a C1. And I happen to have one for sale.
Yeah. Predictably well. So you have paddled a Han C1 for decades.
Yes.
And I remember you paddling it years and years ago, and then I saw you at the 2014 World Championship for canoe slalom at Deep Creek Lake in Maryland. You had one on your truck even then. So it turns out that in that era, in the early 70s, plastic boats, rotomolded plastic, was not yet in production. It was not yet a thing. And so everybody made their own boats or made boats for friends. There wasn't really much of a commercial market. And you developed expertise in boat building, as did many of your friends. And you actually wrote a book, The Boat Builder's Manual, that many of us found invaluable as we dove into the sport and tried to figure out how to create our own kayaks. Talk about what inspired you to write that book and how that whole paradigm flowed.
There were other people in the outing club who wanted to build boats, and so we went up to Penn State, and I can remember following Dave Kurtz around and just driving him absolutely crazy with questions and taking notes. And we eventually got it together mostly, but it was rough. And then when I actually got out paddling, the group I was with, you know, everybody did a lot of boat building, and we'd go out to dinner and everyone would be talking about boat building. You know, what layup did you use? How's that new resin working? And then at races, you'd go around and you look and see what everybody had been doing. And of course, I was, you know, listening to this stuff and absorbing it like a sponge. And my business was slow in the off season, and I said, you know, I just ought to write all this down, and I did. And I wasn't a great boat builder. My manual skills are sort of shaky, but it was stuff that people like John Sweet and Jack Wright and Dave Kurtz and many other people told me. And later, as it went through different editions, I had a good friend, Chip Quaich, who was an engineering major at the University of Virginia, and he helped me by writing something about some of the engineering challenges, and that really helped. But it just seemed like a good thing to do. I printed 3,000 copies, and they sold right out. And I did another 3,000, and they sold out again. And I said, "Oh, I can do this."
Well, I was chatting with a guy. He's actually the sales manager for Piranha Kayaks that makes plastic boats. And I mentioned Boat Builder's Manual. He said, "Of course, I've got one on my shelf." Well, Charlie, one thing I learned about you decades ago is that you see gaps in the knowledge base or in the experience base, and you identify those and you seek to fill them. And that's exactly what you did with Boat Builder's Manual, and you did it more so on the safety front. So let's talk about the icebreaker slalom at Unadilla, New York, and your experience of witnessing a fatality there, and what that did in your mind to orient you to safety. Now, you had been raft guiding for 2 or 3 years at this point professionally.
I raft guided for NOC for a single
for
season.
Nantahala Outdoor Center on the
And then I was back home and went up to the icebreaker slalom, which was the last race. And back then, with club boaters, everybody raced. It was like everybody comes down to the Gauley or goes to the Ocoee. Everybody raced, and we had about 60 people from our 75-person club there. And it was a very popular race, and I was on the course, and I looked downstream coming out of an eddy, and people were, you can tell when something's wrong on the shore. People move differently. And so I pulled over, and there was a foot entrapment right on the course. And this was a Class 1 slalom. This is not some place where you expected to have this happen. And we struggled. We struggled with it, but of course had no idea what the hell to do.
Because the term foot entrapment was not a term then, and nobody had discussed the potential for foot entrapment.
We didn't even know what was holding him there. A couple of guys jumped in the river and tried to grab him as they went past, and that didn't work. And then a bunch of us got into the river, and we were going to block the river and divert the current. But every time we started diverting the current, it started pushing us downstream, and finally they turned the water off at the dam. And it was really unsettling because, these are skilled paddlers and an easy race that was in a very manageable spot. And here you had somebody who died. And I wanted to know what happened. And I talked to people who, safety chair of ACA and a guy who was doing safety for American Whitewater, King Goodwin. And they all said, well, gee, this is just a freak accident. And I talked to people, and eventually, with the help of some people I knew down south who told me about some other accidents, one on the Obed and another on the Nantahala, it's like, this is foot entrapment. This is caused by trying to stand up in Whitewater, and it's really dangerous. And it was something that, as the word got out, it was picked up pretty quickly. And now it's a standard warning to rafting guests and to beginners. And I wrote that article for American Whitewater, and not much happened for a while. And then Bob Taylor, who I paddled with occasionally, drowned downstream there in Lost Paddle Rapid. And Bob was probably the best paddler in the state. There were people coming from out of state who were better, but he was the best native paddler.
In West Virginia.
In West Virginia. He lived in Charleston. And it really shook people up. And somebody called me up and asked me to write a description, and I talked to the guys who were there and wrote it up. And,
his drowning involved an undercut, a sieve, so it wasn't so much a foot entrapment as a
very different type of accident.
Yeah.
The Gauley has all kinds of undercut traps, and he washed into the left side of the top of the fourth drop of Lost Paddle, and we now know that is a really dangerous place. And unfortunately, Bob had to be the one to show us just how dangerous it was.
Well, so here we have you being motivated with curiosity about how the accident at the icebreaker slalom happened, Bob Taylor's drowning, and you're starting to, in your mind, sort out that we could be more proactive. We, as a sport, as an industry, if you will, we can have some methods and we can learn from these accidents that go on. There was another drowning that you witnessed 10 years later, I think.
Oh yeah, well that was very different. And of course, the sport had evolved tremendously back then. And of course, I was interested in these accidents partly to protect myself, and partly because of curiosity. And that one was much more personal. It was a friend in my group who drowned in a river that we probably shouldn't have been on. And I was out on shore scouting a rapid, and I watched him. I threw him a rope, and he couldn't hold on. And that was very different. And with each of these accidents, I tried to describe them so people could read and sort of get an idea of what they take away from it. And, you know, does it mean you don't stand up in the river? There were a lot of what I would call flush drownings in the early 80s. Does it mean you have to be more aware that a life jacket will not protect you 100% of the time? With, you know, with strainers and sieves, getting aware that these are the kinds of things that can get very skilled boaters. And because of this work, I was asked to be safety chair by Chuck Tummins, and that got me into doing a lot of interaction with people on the government side of boating safety. And that was a tremendous education for me, and eventually I think we made it a pretty good education for them.
Well, let's go back. You've mentioned a couple times that you wrote up accident reports, and over the years I have tuned in and read the database that you helped create of accidents, the analysis of how various accidents happen, broken down by year, fatalities. At one point, after a few years, you started cataloging close calls as well.
Well, anytime somebody sends me a close call and it's interesting, I try to get the word out about it, because those you learn a lot from. And the other thing about it is they're positive.
Yeah.
You know, one death after another can be a real downer. But some of the rescues were over the years have been incredibly inventive and quick thinking and courageous, and those are wonderful stories. I don't get enough of them, because
right.
A lot of people, when they have a close call, they're sort of embarrassed, you know. They don't want to talk about it.
Well, in general, people that witness a tragedy or involved in a close call are reluctant to talk, and I remember lots of times where you would cajole or coax people to come out with the story. Please report, because we all need to be aware of how these things happen, and we can all learn from them. So that there's just a natural tendency for people to want to bury tragic stories, and because of the emotional aspect of it.
Not everybody. Some people really want to talk. And okay. I'm the kind of person that really wants to talk.
Right.
You know, when Chuck Rollins died on the Clearwater, I wanted to talk about it.
Right.
I called people up. I talked to Rob Lesser. I talked to Pete Skinner. I talked to a lot of people who boated with Chuck, people who knew the river. But then there are people who don't want to talk, and I try to encourage them to write about it. And sometimes that's all it takes. Oh yeah, I can do this. And sometimes it's like, well, can you help me? And I'll edit their contribution. And sometimes I'll talk to them and write something up and send it to them. But these are the paddling accidents, which tend to be the experienced paddler accidents, which tend to be more complex. The other ones I report on are the no life jacket, high water, cold water. You know, the sort of very basic mistakes that people who don't have any training or experience blunder into, and I've been doing them partly to reinforce the safety message that we have in the American Whitewater Safety Code, and partly to just make American Whitewater a source for this information. Because if we're not the source, some government bureaucrat is going to tell you that he's the expert.
Right.
We have got to be the experts, and the way we're the experts is we have the data. We have the data that goes back further, we analyze it better, and so now, instead of them telling us what's going on, they come to us and ask, and yeah, that's what we want.
Charlie, the curriculum, if you will, the teachings around whitewater safety that you were involved in over the years, talk about those a little bit. I remember you had a publication you called Whitewater Self-Defense that you wrote up. You just mentioned the American Whitewater Safety Standards, Code of Safety. Talk about the evolution of some of those key points that are taught and learned.
Well, of course, it's changed quite a bit because initially the safety code was just a list of basic things like wearing a life jacket and going and paddling in groups and having a helmet if you were in a deck boat or if you were in difficult whitewater. But it's gradually gone beyond that. The safety code has gone through several revisions, and then it went from just talking about safety to actually training. And the person you've really got to give the credit to, or people rather, is Les Bechtel and Slim Ray, because before that, people really didn't train for emergencies, and even at top-rated outdoor places.
So Charlie, we've talked a little bit about curriculum and safety standards and so on, but let's talk a little bit about instructing, your own experience instructing both private users, kayakers, canoeists, private whitewater enthusiasts, and I'll expand that to include raft guides in the recreation realm, but also rescue squads, firefighters, professional first responder types. Talk a little bit about the evolution of those two different tracks.
Well, I think the first rescue instruction that I did was trying to educate firefighters and other first responders, because it became really obvious to me that when there was a rescue emergency and a local squad was called out, and especially if somebody got killed, this just reverberated through the community, and it was terrible for our sport. And it also caused a lot of hostility in the community towards river activities, as opposed to just some guy who went over a dam at high water and got killed. They just decided they didn't like any of this. And so it was a long process, and the first efforts were not that good because I'm not a firefighter and I've never been in the military. So I don't have the rapport with those guys. And you know, we could work on it, but it was tough. I remember doing a clinic up in Scranton where we had a whole bunch of firefighters, and I go in and I demonstrate a swim through a Class 1 rapid, and we could not get any of them to go in the water with us. And so we spent the rest of the day demonstrating skills rather than teaching them. Of course, that's changed tremendously now. But what happened is that within the professional first responder community, they developed different instructors. There were individual guys who taught. There were people like Rescue 3 who had nationwide reach. And then there were state programs like Ohio, Pennsylvania, Maryland, Virginia. All of these guys did basic training for people, and the first responders respond a lot better to somebody from their own community. And as this started taking over, I realized that I was being supplanted, and some of the people who were doing it better than I did. And that's when I started doing some paddle sports.
Well, that's a sign of success. You know,
absolutely,
the progress, and so people teaching themselves and gaining the skills. One of the things that we've talked about before is the way safety protocols began. There was a heavy emphasis on ropes and rope systems, mechanical systems, which are incredibly important, especially handheld rope throwing. And you developed the first throw bag for the sport.
Oh, I didn't develop it. The throw bags were used by the U.S. Navy during World War II and apparently have an even longer history. But I was on the instruction committee of ACA working with the Red Cross on their canoe program. That was back when they had one. And Ray Miller, who was the Red Cross professional I was working with, sent me this drawing of a throw bag. And he says, "Charlie, these things are amazing. You've got to try it." And of course, I'm a yacht guide, and we were very anti-gimmick. Somebody gets stuck, swim out and get them off.
But the yacht guides had throw ropes, just coiled ropes.
They did, but we didn't use them that much. We use the ropes to mostly pick up swimmers, and if God forbid you pin the boat, yeah, you use it. But and the idea of carrying a rope in a bag, that seemed a little weird. But I took a stuff bag from my backpacking gear and put a piece of foam in the bottom and put some rope in, went out to my front door and threw it, and it's like, holy smokes, this is really cool. So
accuracy, convenience, portability.
The main thing was that you could carry this thing and it was ready to go. You could be in your boat. You could be in your boat for a week, and you could take it and throw it. Where I carried a bare line, and you would have to get the line out. You'd uncoil it. You'd throw it out. You'd let the water undo the kinks. You'd pull it in, and then you'd be ready to throw.
With a nice, perfectly coiled rope, ready to throw.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And if you didn't do that, you just wouldn't get anywhere. But
well, on the products front, you developed that throw bag. You actually marketed it through your own small company, Whitewater Designs. And the other item I remember you advancing was the high float life jacket, a PFD with additional buoyancy.
That was inspired by a couple of swims at Pillow Rock.
Swims by you?
Well, of course. I'd say my batting average at Pillow Rock those first years was about 50%.
And Pillow Rock, by the way, is a rapid here on the upper Gauley River that gets people's attention. Let's put it that way.
It's really big. When I first got to it, I had no idea what I was looking at it, and I was with a group, and everyone goes, "Oh yeah, okay, yep, we go do this and that." And I got into it. It was like, holy smokes, this thing is enormous. And came out of my boat and went flying over Volkswagen Rock and then down to the bottom. And after a swim or two, I thought, maybe you need a jacket with more flotation. And I took the sort of Harashock layout, because Harashock was the jacket that we were using the most, and just said, how can I get more flotation into it? And the high float was the result. It was quite the mainstream life jacket for a few years. Now everyone would laugh at it.
So a standard PFD these days might have what?
16.5 pounds 17. Is the Coast Guard standard.
And your high floats had
26 and a half.
26, so that's quite a bit more buoyancy.
You float higher.
The standard. Although those high floats work great for raft guides. They were a little bulky. Many kayakers felt they, for.
Oh, I have a picture of Rob Lesser and John Wasson and a couple of other hotshots on the Stikine.
There we go.
All posing in their high float life jackets, and of course they just rolled the bottom up.
Yeah.
But you're right. The days of the high float as a mainstream kayaking jacket were very short. But then they got a new life with raft guides, with first responders. They hung on for years and years. They've only been out of production for about 5 or 6 years.
Well, there's some. I was on a Grand Canyon trip a year and a half ago, and former raft guide friend from this part of from the southeast had his high float, and it was that was his go-to PFD for the Grand Canyon, of course. Let's talk for a minute about urgent rescue techniques where there's someone in trouble in a river. There are rope systems, but then there are more direct human people mobilizing and perhaps going hands-on. Talk about the contrast between approaches to urgent situations.
Well, certainly Les and Slim were very ropes oriented, and a lot of it was because Les was an expert mountaineer and he brought a lot of that technique with him. But when I took his course, I was thinking, this is very interesting, but I can't see the boys on the yacht picking any of this stuff up. And they were very much, get in the water, solve the problem. Boat pin, let's get a couple of guys out there and unpin it. Somebody's swimming and in trouble. If you can't get to them with a kayak and you can't hit them with a rope, jump into the water and grab them. And I eventually started teaching a one-day course, which I called Whitewater Self-Defense, which was swimming, wading, using throw bags, both throwing and catching. And it was controversial. I was doing it on the Delaware River, which was a popular place for all the locals. And I had some people come up and, right in the middle of my class, "This is really dumb. You're going to kill somebody. This is dangerous." And I'd go, "Hey, Tom, it's me." But he, Tom Cassidy, among other people, was just convinced that I was going to kill somebody. And I mean, he'd catch me at the takeout and dress me down. And because paddlers at that time were really afraid of swimming.
Right.
And one of the things that a basic rescue class will do is, if you find yourself in the water, you know what to do. You can protect yourself. You know when to swim, you know when to wade, you know how to catch a rope. And so I'd say 90% of the incidents, maybe 95% of the incidents, can be handled by just people taking care of things themselves, getting themselves to shore, friends bringing their gear over. If a boat is stuck wading out, one of the things I was really pleased with is there was a young woman taking the course with her boyfriend, and she was very tentative, and then a couple of weeks later, her boyfriend comes up to me and he says, "You ought to have seen her. There was a boat pinned down below Bottle of Wine Rapid, and she just waded out and grabbed it." And it's like, that's cool, because that's exactly what we want. We want people to have the confidence to manage things.
Well, one of my experiences in my years, mostly professional, running raft trips on the Ocoee and sometimes elsewhere, was that I found it important for me to pre-visualize what I might do in a given set of hypothetical circumstances, and that actually that became more real. There was I was on the staff at Nantahala Outdoor Center. I was on the staff at Nantahala Outdoor Center after my Ocoee years, when a canoeist came off Nantahala Falls. The left side is a little vertical, and he went vertical, and he was doing what he thought the proper thing was, feet up, feet downstream, but that had him pencil vertically down, and his foot became entrapped in a gap down in the riverbed, and he was trapped with his head sadly under a couple feet of water. But
I remember that.
I walked up to the scene when it was a recovery, perhaps 30 minutes after, and I remember there were other river professionals there, and I thought through this, what would I do? And we got together and I said, so how would we implement a rescue here? And one person said, well, I would set a rope up from this tree to and I'm like, wait a minute. The amount of time it takes to set the ropes up may not be enough. How about going hands-on? Another person said, well, one of the rules is you never expose the rescuer to hazard in the rescue. And
it's that's nonsense.
Well, and the discussion evolved to where I think all of us came to the realization that if we were on the scene and had witnessed that, we might just swim into the water, go deep, get our hands on the victim's leg, down deep, and try to unentrap that foot. And that might even require taking my own PFD off in order to get deep enough to do that, which sounds iffy, but when there's a life at stake, I feel like I can swim out of the base of Nantahala Falls as long as I'm not plugging my own foot in. And
what we're doing now is getting a group wade out there, or even a line-assisted wade. That can be done very quickly, and I really give the credit to the yacht guides for developing that technique.
Group wading, meaning we stabilize each other with hands on.
two or three people. If you can wade out, and if you're upstream of the person, you create an eddy, and then you can work. But if the person is heads down, there are very few successful heads down rescues, and it's just a desperate situation.
Another thing I've heard you talk about in the past is the readiness emotionally, mentally, of somebody, that a paddler or a responder that that is faced with an urgent situation. And some people just react differently. Some people respond quickly and aggressively and act. Others might tend to be cautious or frozen, uncertain what to do. What is your reflection on what you've seen happen through incident reports and so on?
Well, I think the simplest way to describe it is that if you see a situation that you can't figure out a way of handling it, you're going to freeze up. And the best way to protect yourself from that is training. I have a friend who later became a physician's assistant. We were on a scene of an accident, and he was just a mess. I mean, he was throwing up, and he was freaking out. I wasn't doing that great, but I was at least a little better than he was. And I asked him later how he became a doctor. And he said, well, when that happened, I didn't know anything. But now when I know things, and when somebody comes in, I'm just clicking things off through my mind, things to check, things to do. And I think in the same way, paddlers who've had a good swiftwater rescue course, when something happens, they're not saying, oh my God. It's like, okay, this is there, we need to do this. And of course, the faster you can react, the more likely you are to keep a manageable problem from getting out of control.
One of the reflections I have, and both my sons had experience in professional whitewater leadership. One son was a raft guide on Section 4 of the Chattooga, where you learned a little bit about safety yourself, and I did as well. And that helped him develop a safety and awareness. My younger son was a camp counselor and leader at a whitewater summer camp, and later for a private academy, boys' school that ran outdoor trips. And I was glad that both of them had the professional experience. Now, not everybody can do that, so training and experience on the river, there's really no shortcut around that.
Well, being a guide or a counselor or a club leader, it teaches you to watch out for people and to think ahead, and not just to go barreling down the river where you sort of know things, and if something comes up, you can wiggle your way out of it. You've got to consider who you're with, and I'm sure that a lot of my safety work started at Camp Mountly, where I spent my late teens and early 20s looking after the welfare of groups of young boys. And once you get that attitude, it really carries over into a lot of things. As with your sons doing commercial work, of course, you got to have a company that really inspires that. And I can tell you, I've been with some companies that a little lax. Of course, most of those companies aren't operating that way nowadays.
Your contributions, we've talked about various ways you have provided leadership, research, filled in a lot of gaps in knowledge, modeled great practices on the safety front. The whitewater community is going to be forever grateful, because I am certain that this sport, which does have its hazards, wouldn't be as safe as it is. The folks that we saw going past us headed down the upper gully, that's a challenging, hazardous section of river, and there are a lot of skills that those people carry with them, and some gear they carry with them that can be tied back to some things that you led on. So on behalf of the whitewater community, thank you very much. And I think the same sort of thing can be said for the professional rescue first responder community as well. And of course, you mentioned Slim Ray and Les Bechtel, and we all owe them the same debts of gratitude.
There have just been so many people who've contributed to all these things over the years. I think I get more credit than I deserve, because I'm a writer and a storyteller, and I'm the one who puts it on paper. And there are a lot of people over the years who, really advance things. Like Les Bechtel taught hundreds of courses in the early years, but he wasn't a writer. Right. So nobody knows what Les did. Now Slim is a writer, and people are more likely to know him than Les. And then there are, guys like Glenn Carlson, an amazing rescue instructor who taught me a bunch of things.
He's Rescue 3.
No, that's you're thinking Jim Segerstrom.
Yeah, that's right.
Glenn never became part of Rescue 3, and in fact, he's not active now. But at one time, he owned a part of Whitewater Unlimited.
Oh, right.
But all of these people, and the thing is, I would go around and learn from them and write about it.
Well, I said it earlier in the interview. One thing that is special about you, Charlie, is you see gaps or voids in systems where things could go better. So your leadership on, for instance, the database of incidents, you were responding to something that you saw could help the community, and you stepped forward to help it fill in. You've done that over and over. Wrapping up our chat about safety here, Charlie, what would you say about the current state of safety practices, both knowledge and implementation on the river, and where is it going from here?
Well, it's come a long way, because I know from when I started, a safety nut was somebody who had a coiled rope in his boat. And a lot of us, we didn't know how to necessarily use it. We just, when something happened, we'd get out and scratch our head and try and figure out what's going on. Now people, they have better gear. They're carrying safety gear. I mean, I'd be willing to bet that most people nowadays have a throw bag in their boat. They probably have some kind of a pin kit along. They have first aid equipment along, and a lot of them have advanced first aid and rescue training. And I know this because when I get an accident report, quite often they'll say what the qualifications of the people were, and it becomes pretty obvious. And I can tell you, in my heyday in the late 70s and early 80s, we were not as well trained. We were not as prepared. The outfitter of today, or the private paddler of today, is so much better prepared and is also much more aware in terms of precautions. And we hope that continues. There'll always be people who push the limits of risk, and there'll be other people who are very cautious. It runs the whole continuum. And but in general, the change in the sport is amazing.
Charlie, we started this interview talking about the 50 years of you running the Gully, and you've actually been paddling for closer to 54 years total on Whitewater, and you've loved it passionately every step of the way. And I love the fact that you still see it that way. One way you express your love for the sport is through work on local rivers that are, let's say your backyard or your home rivers, those two being the Cheat River and the Upper Youghiogheny River. And you've actually provided local leadership politically and on the fundraising front, as well as participating on boards of directors and so on, and there have been some successes. Talk a little bit about each of those two rivers.
Well, there've been huge successes. With the Upper Yough, I can remember we've gone through a lot of changes up there, and it's taken a while to be accepted by the local community. And you go back, say, to the 90s, when we were definitely accepted, but we were considered something of a nuisance because the people would park on both sides of the road for a half mile in each direction, and it was an annoyance to some people. And I knew Jess Whittemore from my guiding days, and he got into the squirt boating scene, and we sort of diverted. I like to stay on the surface, but I always respected him tremendously as a paddler. And he lived in Friendsville and got on town council and was really pushing the idea that this paddling could be good for the town.
And Friendsville is the put-in for the Upper Yough.
The takeout.
The takeout, excuse me.
The put-in is a piece of land that an outfitter bought, and he kept a little piece for himself and then gave the rest to a land trust. Well, we may have sold it to a land trust. I'm not
Right.
really sure of the details, but that was really important.
But the takeout was the issue.
But the takeout was becoming an issue because it's in the center of town. People were taking out all over. And one of the first things I did with social media, and we couldn't do it without social media, was getting the word that, look, we don't want people taking out on Water Street. We don't want people parking on Water Street. The people who live there really resent it. And we don't want to see you there. We don't want you parking under the highway bridge and over by the church because the locals don't want it. Now, if it was the only place, maybe we'd pick a fight. But it's not the only place. We had some really good access and people were just being lazy. And I got that word out, and I showed up at the town council meeting as an AW board member, mostly to apologize. And I had a number
Which can be effective.
Well, you got to start somewhere. And
Yeah.
there was no reason for people to be doing that stuff. There was one guy who, he's changing clothes between his van and somebody's house.
Yeah.
There's just no excuse for that. And so I apologized for them and told them we were working it. And one of the ladies who lived on Water Street says, you've already made a difference. Keep it up. Thank you so much. And then Jess Whittemore says, we need to get the parking off the street. And my reaction was, I don't know, it's working okay. But he had an idea, and he approached the lady who had been at that meeting, Mrs. Franz. And Mrs. Franz said that she would give us a piece of property. And then Jess had a plan for it. And we figured it was going to be easy, but it's Maryland. Maryland is the regulation capital of the universe. If it was
some others would argue with you about that, but
there are other competitors for that.
Yeah, okay.
For that title, but living in West Virginia, if it had been in West Virginia, we would have just called somebody in, spread some gravel, and that would have been done. Well, there was like $60,000 in engineering. We raised $25,000, and that changed the relationship
from within the paddling community.
From within the paddling community, online.
Right.
And that changed the relationship with the town, because the always thing was, well, these people, they just come and they take and they don't do anything. And I gave Mayor Schwarzenegger a check for $20,000, and his treasurer said, we're getting checks from all over the country, because I said people could go directly to the town. He said, we've gotten some from out west and here and there, and I think it showed them just how much the river was loved. And it took a number of years for Jess to raise the money, but because we had raised this seed money, he could go to a state agency or to a foundation and say, look at what we've done and we need some more. And they raised significant money.
And it got done. It
got done.
It was done. And then how about the Cheat River? A similar type effort over at the Cheat.
Similar thing. When I moved to Brewston Mills, I eventually got on the board of Friends of Cheat. Worked for a really remarkable executive director, Keith Pitzer. Keith was somebody, he could talk to anybody, whether it was some upper level bureaucrat or some farmer who he needed to get permission to do some work on his property. And they were doing a lot of water quality work. And I said, this is great, but we need to do something that's more tangible to the community. Because the water quality work has been incredible. It changed from like an orange stream with brown foam in the eddies to really a stream that looks quite a lot like the Gauley. But it's not something that you see quickly. But access, that's something that people really relate to. And the takeout for the Cheat and Big Sandy Rivers was getting pretty nuts. There were people driving ATVs all over the place. There were people jumping off the bridge and getting killed. A lot of drinking, a lot of carousing, drug dealing. Couple of cars burned. It was getting a little Wild West. And Keith and I talked about it, and I raised about $16,000 online, and Keith got that matched from the state DNR. and we put some controls in there. We put a rock border in and some gates, and so that essentially made it a little less desirable for the rowdies, and also showed that someone was taking care of the place. And over the last, well, this was 2006 that this happened, so over the last 15 years, the culture has really changed. Now we finally got the access point in the hands of a land trust with access written into the deed.
Right.
And so, you know, we've made huge progress. It's been slow. I mean, I can tell you sometimes I went down there with a pickup truck and would come out with 18 contractor bags full of trash. But now I go down there and there's maybe half a bag. And we've got Friends of Cheat staff doing most of that anyway. But Keith was the guy who made it happen, because when I told him I could do this, he says, "Oh yeah, well if you do that, I'll do this." And we did the same thing with an access point on the Big Sandy. We raised about $8,000, and that was amazing because we bought a little piece of property, and then Keith got Scott Roadtruck, who was on the board of Chesapeake Energy, and Chesapeake owned it, but it wasn't anything to do with their stuff. He got Chesapeake to give the lot to us, and then a logging company wanted to put an access road through the upper part of that property, so they traded with some riverside land that they had in exchange for permission to go through the upper part. And some of the conservation groups weren't too happy with us, but it's like they're going to log the thing anyway. We can't stop them, so we might as well work with them, and we did.
Well, that pragmatism, Charlie, again, is another hallmark of your engagement on all fronts. And not everybody is as pragmatic and adaptive as you are. And again,
well, I can tell you that in West Virginia, we are, you know, Friends of Cheat has not been popular with some of the mainstream conservation organizations.
Sure. Well, different players play different roles. American Whitewater has, of course, learned from examples like the two you just spoke of on the Upper Yaak and the Cheat, and those successes are being replicated elsewhere around the country.
Well, they're just amazing. When I was on the board, we would have one success, which we would be all excited about and bragging about. Now, typically in a given year, they have like a dozen successes like that.
For river access or protection.
And most important, what they're doing is they have relationships with river managers and landowners. So instead of going in there fighting something, they're in there on the ground floor at the planning stage, preventing stupid ideas from seeing
their
the
staff
light of
and their American Whitewater staff and board members are getting better and better at that. And by the way, you know, I hope our viewers, if viewers are inspired by any of this discussion we're having today, a great way to put your own stamp on efforts like this and honor the work that people like Charlie Walbridge have done is make sure you're a current member of AW and ACA, and make sure that you not only pay your membership fee, but consider an additional donation to support that work, because it's not done for free, and it's critical to the sport that we all love. And Charlie, let's plan to get back together a year from now here on the Gauley River.
yeah.
And you know, as they say, God willing, and the creek don't rise. Of course, we want the creek to rise. We want the
just not too much.
Just
not
the right
much.
amount. 2,800 CFS would be about right for.
Actually, I could go back to 22 or 24.
Well,
I liked it that way.
Yeah, those were my early days as well. But again, on behalf of the Whitewater community, Charlie, you have brought gifts to this sport and to this movement that are beyond what most of us can even fathom doing ourselves. So thank you so much for that, and it's great hanging out with you here on the Gauley.
Oh, it's fun. The thing that keeps me going is you're not only in beautiful places, but you have great people.
Well,
and
I
you're just
that.
another great person that I've had the pleasure of meeting. If it wasn't for rivers, we never would have known each other.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Well, we'll just wrap it up there, and thanks everybody for watching.